Welcome to NewYorkBIO's Virtual Breakfast Series, a digital program started in 2020 featuring fireside chats with leaders from across the healthcare spectrum. This week's episode features New York City native Elliott Francis, now the Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer for the Biotechnology Innovation Organization, better known as BIO.
All right. Good morning, everyone. My name is Jennifer Hawks Bland, and I'm the CEO at NewYorkBIO. We're thrilled you've joined us for yet another installment of our virtual breakfast series. It's hard to believe. I think we're closing in on almost a year of doing our virtual breakfast series. So we've been thrilled to have you as our partners throughout. And one particular partner who was actually our first partner sponsor for the series last summer is our current sponsor, Goodwin Procter. So we're really thankful that for the investment that they've put in. And we've seen a lot of their clients as companies featured on the webinar over time, just happenstance. They do a lot of work in New York. So we're really thankful for their partnership. This morning, we have a fascinating conversation with Elliott Francis, who is the Chief Diversity Officer at BIO in Washington, D.C. But maybe even more important for our audience is that he is a native New Yorker. So yes, he is here and ready to talk to our New York Bio audience this morning. As usual, a couple of housekeeping matters. As Derek and I have our conversation with Elliott, please put your questions in the Q&A box or in the chat, and we will get to them just as best as we are able. With that, I'll turn it over to Derek to do a little more detailed introduction of Elliott, and then we'll get to our conversation. Thanks so much.
Okay, Elliott, good morning. Thank you so much for joining us today. We tend to kick off these with a little bit of an origin story and a little bit about where you came from. So you're the Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer from BIO, but your background is you didn't come from the life sciences industry, coming from places like Booz Allen Hamilton, and if I check my notes, the Department of the Treasury, which is let's say a little bit diverse. So can you talk a little bit about how you kind of came to BIO, how you found this opportunity, and really what kind of steps brought you here?
Yeah, so first, I just want to thank you both, Jennifer and Derek, for having me in the breakfast series. I'm excited to do this. And when I saw that New York was asking me to speak, I said, oh, without a doubt.
You're obligated.
I'm obligated, right? So I live in Virginia, Northern Virginia, just outside of DC here at BIO where I work, but I'm a New Yorker through and through. So I just want to say that, in fact, I've been down here now for about 18 years, but I still have a 917 number on my cell phone. I was never going to let that go. So
no, keep that. Keep that.
So to answer your question, Derek, how did I navigate my way to bio and the life science biotech industry? It's a really good question. And I don't know how far back you'd like me to go, but I'll start with the professional, and then throughout the course of the conversation, if you want to go further back, happy to do so also. So yeah, I have a very interesting story I want to start with. So I started my professional diversity and inclusion and equity career, and this was at Booz Allen Hamilton, which is a management consulting firm. It is here in Northern Virginia. And I remember when I was hired to their internal diversity and inclusion team, I was really nervous. I had done some work. I did some research. My studies at Middlebury College in Vermont was around sociology and human institutions. So I was really interested in how organizations operated, develop strong cultures, and with a focus on how inclusion practices need to be strong in order to ensure you get the most productive, get the most productivity out of a workforce. And so when I sat down with the director of the diversity team at Booz Allen, I was so ready to impress him with my credentials and experience and everything. And he's probably 3 or 4 levels above me, so in my chain of command. And I sit down, and his name was Patrick McLaurin. He unfortunately passed away some years ago. And great guy, fantastic guy. I sit down with him, and he says to me, he says, okay, so tell me about yourself. Who are you? So I launched right into my credentials. Well, I went to school here and I've studied this and I'm, my interest is, he said, yeah, I didn't ask you that. He said, again, who are you? I said, okay, I didn't quite understand the first time. So I went right back into it. Well, I've studied this, and I wanted him to know that I was going to be a good hire, right? So I'm doing everything to present my credentials and try to convince him of that. And so he stopped me and he said, okay, now I hear all that and I get that. This is not an interview. You've gotten the job.
Right.
I need to get to know who you are as a person. So what I'm asking you is who you are, meaning what is your value system? What matters to you as an individual? And he said, for me to understand that, once I can understand that as who you are, it's a part of your social identity, then I can help you navigate your career. But I can't do that if I don't ask you those questions and you don't share.
Yeah.
And so that was the truest, most purest form of engagement from a leader that I had ever had, and it stuck with me. After about an hour of conversing, I was talking about my background and where I grew up and why, and he told me about his, and we connected. And there was this intense connection at that point. When I walked out of there, I didn't feel like I just, shared with my boss 3 or 4 levels removed. I felt like we connected on a much deeper level, and that was to me a real expression of inclusion, and that stuck with me throughout my career. So whoever I interacted with, whether it be a peer or somebody I reported to or somebody who reported to me, I start with that. Who are you? Who are you? How do you want to be identified, to get a sense of who they are? And I share the same, and we can build that connection. The work will come. So that was the start, really, of my professional career. And it was a good start, a really good start. And Booz Allen, our client at the time, well, the diversity team, we did a lot of internal diversity and inclusion work to make sure that we were the employer of choice from a recruitment standpoint, an attraction standpoint, professional development, advancement, succession planning. We wanted to make sure that if you look at the entire continuum of an employee life cycle, that we were having a positive impact on every single employee as they go through their career at Booz Allen. So we had 40 different business units. All of them had to report up to the board level what they were doing from an equity, diversity, and inclusion standpoint. And there was really no one left behind. And these goals and metrics were tied to the business outcomes. And it was a novel idea years ago when we had done that. We hadn't heard of any other organization doing it. It was really transformative. And at first, there was some folks who worked in the organization on the business side that pushed back against it because they didn't quite understand the value in focusing so much on this. But over time, they saw productivity levels rising, innovation being more harnessed from the diverse perspectives that they started seeing, right? They started seeing from that momentum, we just kept carrying on. Fast forward many years later, I started doing some human capital consulting. I love adding to my skill set. In addition to my core EDI function, I wanted to do some change management work. And I had a client with the National Science Foundation while I was working at Booz Allen. They were undergoing a pretty significant change management administrative functions shift in their organization. And I was part of the consulting team to help them through that. And what underscored that project, obviously, was making sure we were taking into consideration the diverse people levels and where they needed to eventually reside. That contract was fantastic. It ended about 4 years later, at which point NSF asked me, hey, would you like to come over into the government? And I said, oh, I never really thought about it. This so happened to be at a time my wife and I both worked at Booz Allen at the same time. We were just working crazy hours, and we had 2 young, small kids. And we didn't have family in the area. So we talked about it. And we had heard that federal employees had much more work-life balance. And we needed one of us to be able to have that to help raise the family, but still have a pretty rewarding and challenging career. So I took that opportunity, and it was one of the best opportunities that I had taken. This was also at the time under the first Obama administration, and there was an executive order mandating that all federal agencies develop a diversity and inclusion strategic plan, one that integrated with that federal agency's overarching strategic plan. So I was tapped to lead that, and of course, I was all about that. Great. That
Yep.
meant we had to get feedback from all corners of the organization to make sure that we had a diverse workforce. It was an inclusive environment. We were looking at equity levels across the board, and again, that it was tied into what we were doing. NSF was all about issuing out grants for research, and we had to make sure we were doing that in an equitable sort of way. So we took that into consideration in the plan that we developed. So fast forward beyond there, there was an opportunity at the Department of Treasury, which I never thought I would work at the Department of Treasury. It just didn't seem to be sexy to me, but but at the same time, I'm a person that's driven by mission and by an organization's vision. And the Department of Treasury had a great opportunity in their Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Office, which what appealed to me most when I took that opportunity was the size of it. At the time, there was 88,000 employees spread out amongst the US, and we had to build EDI programs that would cover the entire 88,000 employees. It was a much larger effort that I had never really contended with before. So I said, all right, I'm licking my chops. Let's give this a shot and see how we can make this work. And my specific function was to make sure that everything we developed from an EDI standpoint integrated into all of our human capital processes. Human capital processes is everything that's HR related, right? Talent management as well. And I had to make sure that our EDI programs not only benefited those who are inside the Beltway at headquarters, but everyone out in the districts. And every single district has its own unique subculture. So we had to take all of that into consideration and make sure we developed something that that really resonated with the people in that particular area. So tons of research, a lot of outreach, and then deployment of activities and programs that would be appropriate for folks. And that was great. The way that the bio opportunity came about. So Department of Treasury, I was at the IRS, and then toward my end of my federal career, I was at the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, which is a smaller sub-bureau of the Department of Treasury. And they were financial regulators. I was doing EDI work and enterprise workforce planning work there as well. But I started looking for a new opportunity. I wanted something else because I tend to get kind of antsy after about 3 to 5 years and want to expand my skill set. And I started researching the biotech space. The reason I started researching it was because this is around the time that the whole COVID-19 was percolating very early, right? And there was some buzz around the biotech companies, pharma companies working on if this is going to actually be a global pandemic, therapeutics, diagnostics, vaccines that would need to be developed to address it. And I said, wow, that is a very important mission. And then, as we saw very quickly, COVID became a global pandemic and we locked down, right? And so this is around the time I had interviewed with Bio. I started learning more about it, researching, and just the core of what Bio does was so appealing to me, not just because of COVID, but because they're at the intersection of innovation and healthcare and agriculture and industry and environment. They want to heal the world. And I said, what better mission to be a part of than to do something like that for me, right? And if I can bring my experience, my knowledge, my skill set, my contacts to bear to help move this mission forward, I'm all in if they want to bring me in. And so I went through the interview process. I was just completely enamored with it. And I got an offer at the time when the lockdown happened, right at the lockdown. So my wife and I were talking about it. We said, okay, do I leave the safety of a federal job and go into the unknown and just kind of hope and a prayer that that this will be a great move? And I haven't looked back ever since. It's been hard, rewarding, challenging work, But I am so impressed with everyone that I've worked with in this particular space. The member companies are fantastic, building really innovative solutions to some of our toughest diseases, rare diseases. Just to be able to see the companies huddle up and work together in a collaborative fashion to address this issue that affected humankind was just amazing. So I'm going to stop because I said a whole lot and allow you two to jump in and ask any questions. But yeah, sorry, that was maybe 15 minutes.
No, that's good.
That's okay.
No, that's good. And I actually have a question that is going to take you back a little further, right? So it's not, I mean, so you came right out of undergrad, and I think not many students, kids, right, at that age think about DEI as sort of a career path. I feel like more people find like they're working in an organization and then they have the opportunity to work on a DEI initiative. So, and we're talking what, 18 years ago. So Booz Allen was definitely on sort of the forefront of thinking that way. How did you even find that as a career path from Middlebury?
That's a great question, and it does take me back, Jennifer. So I grew up in Harlem in the 70s, and back then I love Harlem. Don't get me wrong, I absolutely love it. I wouldn't want it to have grown up anywhere else in Upper Manhattan. It was just the best. But the reality of my early experience is that it was a fairly impoverished area, and it was also homogenous. It was African American, predominantly African American, but unfortunately, we didn't have access to a lot of the great things that some of my white, more affluent counterparts had, access to education, good education, nutrition, healthcare, all that stuff. But I didn't know any better. I didn't know any better. I was only exposed to that. It wasn't until I was 13 where my mom, single mom, who did something completely revolutionary, she sent me and my 4 siblings away to boarding school. And because she recognized that education was important for our development in life, well, let's find a place to send you. Thankfully, we got into a program for young and gifted students in the inner cities and send them away to boarding schools and to get a better education. So I went to Westminster School in Simsbury, Connecticut at the age of 13. And it was the first time I had been exposed to the inequities that exist. I probably knew about them conceptually, but I'm a kid. What am I really thinking about, right? Yeah. So I go to school, and in the truest sense, I'm a minority, not just racially, not just ethnically, but socioeconomically, really. Mm-hmm. And I'm seeing how the other side lives. I mean, they had the financial means to do whatever it is they wanted. It was a beautiful campus, an incredible experience, but I also did experience a lot of racism that was deep rooted into the culture. I wasn't a part of the dominant culture. I was one who came from outside to this dominant culture, and without them saying it, I believed I was expected to assimilate or fit into that culture. And I don't think it was the intent of the institution. I just don't believe the institution had been charged or forced with being inviting to others that didn't come out of from those backgrounds that they're accustomed to. So the 4 years that I was there, Jennifer, to answer your question, is really what sparked my interest in differences. And at the time, it was maybe 2 or 3 dimensional. It was gender, race, ethnicity, and then the economic piece. Later, I understood all the multi dimensions of diversity that are at play at all times. And so that experience was very significant to me as I lived and navigated through it. And that's where I first understood what inclusion meant without really knowing the term, but realizing that the institution had to be intentionally inclusive of those who were not a part of the dominant culture. And they did not do that only because they didn't know how to. Plus, if you think about the 100 years they had been in existence, they've been pretty successful. So why would you change the formula, right?
Yeah.
So that's what really propelled me to study this as a career, as a progression, as a profession, because I wanted to somehow help organizations understand that the incredible brilliance and genius that comes out of connecting with people based on their unique experience and background could give them the differential advantage in business. And you want people just to feel a sense of belonging so they can truly be themselves in an organization. And so you're right. I've come across a lot of people in the professional space where they happened into EDI work because of a project, to your point. But for me, it was something that was deep rooted in my life experience early that just carried all the way through. So I personally feel that it was divinely orchestrated that way, in fact, and I just had to carry on. It's hard work, it's rewarding work, but it also challenges you as an individual to not be this way at work and not this way in your regular life. In my regular life, I also have to be inclusive. I have to be culturally competent. I like engaging people to find out who they are. What's your story? You were telling me your story before we went live, Jennifer. I was like, that's interesting about your family and your kids and where they were born.
Yes.
It's fascinating. So that's how my interest and how the seeds of my interest around equity, diversity, inclusion were planted, and they grew and were cultivated over time. And it was no question that this was the life's work that I was going to do.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. And it's also interesting that someone from frankly, like most of us, high school, you're checking some boxes, and then you go into college and you figure out what else you're interested in. But you had a calling so early in your life to the work you're going to do. Really amazing.
I'm interested too about the transition with both, Middlebury and Booz Allen Hamilton, right? Because I went to Hamilton, which is a very similar school to Middlebury, and I don't know what Middlebury was like, but Hamilton is not the most diverse place in the world, right? And when you think of management consulting, again, I think they can be progressive on a number of fronts, but also if you think about it as an industry, it's not necessarily known for its diversity. So I imagine that. And I'm going to weave in a question here from the audience too. Did the person that asked you who you were at Booz Allen Hamilton, did they also have either a similar story or what did they build on to ask you that question? Because I imagine that was not the first time they asked somebody that question in that scenario, right? So did they have something from their career that they built on to kind of say, this is how I want to help these people frame the way that they think?
It's a good question. I can't say I know exactly Patrick's experiences to answer that question, but I will say he was one of the most unique individuals that I had ever had the pleasure of working with. And we called him the Dean of Diversity back then because, to your point, Jennifer, Booz Allen was really on the forefront of doing a full-scale, enterprise-wide board diversity initiative. Just other organizations may have been doing it in fits and spurts or pockets of an organization, but nothing this comprehensive at an enterprise level that was reported up to the board. I had never heard that at the time. It was just a novel idea. And Patrick was the architect of that concept. And he was just one of those amazing leaders that really lived what he practiced, right? And so I don't know where that came from, his desire to connect with people on such a fundamental core level, and then to be able to have the courage to ask those questions, and then the active listening skills to hear what you're saying, right? Because there's things that you can just say out your mouth, and a lot of times people listen because it's a right, or people listen to what you say because somehow it justifies what you think. And so you're like, oh yeah, I'm listening to that, but not all the 80 other % of what you said. But he would sit there.
Have you talked to my children?
Well, I have so we know. But it's fascinating. To this day, I tell his story because I want his legacy to live. I don't know how he became that way or why, but I'm just so fortunate to have been able to learn from him and work with him for, I think it was 7 years or so. It was just fascinating. And so I saw him do that with everyone at all levels, didn't matter if you were a partner at Booz or an associate or a senior consultant or a client or a child or anyone. He just was that, and it was that authenticity and that curiosity and willingness to get to know someone that was so powerful. And I feel, so this is my personal philosophy on this. There's a lot of disciplines you have in the workplace, right? And skill sets. I believe that EDI work, you need to embody that work. Like, you need to have a personal connection to it so that you can do this work in earnest, right? I just believe that the most powerful EDI professionals or practitioners are those who can connect it back to real experiences and bring that to bear. So who you're talking to and hearing from today, Elliott Francis, is exactly who I am when I go and leave this Zoom call and interact with my wife or my kids or my neighbors or the kids that I coach or whatever it is. And he embodied that as well, Patrick McLaurin. So don't know where it came from, but it was just amazing.
Yeah, I've always said with me, what you see is what you get.
Yep.
It's this way. I'm
Yeah,
a little crazy all the time.
No, yeah, we don't do anything to quote unquote get into character for these webinar episodes. This is pretty much what
I
we've
love
got.
it. I love
Yeah.
it. I love it. Especially in a time like this now. I mean, COVID, the last year, and even up until now, we're seeing progress now, which is great. We've been seeing progress for a while. But it's been tough across the board. There's no one that hasn't felt the stress or the struggle in some capacity. And so to be able to be authentically who you are and all your imperfections is great. And then for people I say people need to extend a little bit more grace to each other, because we've all been constricted so much last year. So if we mess up or misspeak or hey, listen, these have been crazy circumstances that we've never had to deal with in our lifetime, in our generation. So just have a little bit more grace, because you'd want it, right? So extend it.
I think that's pretty consistent, right? Because you know, I think in general over the past year with everyone on Zoom, you get this little window into other people's life that you didn't have before. You look at the background of their house, and you know, their kids come into the frame. You know, famously, my son came in and danced behind us during literally the first one of these that we had, just as we were trying to wrap up. I was utterly mortified. But you know, what are you gonna,
mortifying for you, but a treat for everyone else.
Thankfully, our guest was remarkably gracious through the whole thing, and kind of his reaction, it was the exact perfect reaction that I needed, because I was trying to keep my cool and not do anything else, and he's there now realizing that he has an audience, which is never, the second one's a performer. So once he realizes he has an audience, it's all over.
That's great.
So before you came to Bio, right? Bio had just released their first annual report on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And was this something that you had access to before you stepped into the organization? Was it kind of a topic of conversation as you were considering whether to jump on board?
Yes, and yes, and yes. So I did my homework, and I was actually really pleased to see that Bio had issued a survey amongst its member companies to get a baseline of data for the industry. And so this was what I read, I believe, in January 2020 was the first report. So 2019 is when they issued the survey, and then 2020 is when they issued the report. It was with an organization formerly called Center for Talent Innovation. It's CoQual now. And I read through it front and back, and I actually came to the interview with questions about it. Just its purpose and some of the data. I had specific questions about the data and the analysis and what they were hoping to achieve from it. And they were pretty straightforward. Again, their understanding, which I appreciated, was that we don't have enough data right now to know how we are collectively doing as an industry around increasing diversity, if we're accomplishing inclusion, if we're addressing inequities. And so this was the first step to baseline where we are so we can know how to improve, what those gaps are and how we can improve from there. They also explained to me that this was an effort that's intended to be annual, so we can see how our progress looks like over time. So, obviously the data, which is it's not crazy to think, wasn't as solid as we had liked to see. I mean, but there were some bright spots. They had 98 companies, I believe, at the time respond to the first survey, which it's not bad actually. But one of the stark things that stood out for me was just the questions that were asked of the companies were around, what are your current D&I programs? What's your current diversity demographic breakdown in your organization? What's the state of D&I within your organization? Do you have programs that are specific to, say, women's advancement or people of color advancement? Are you looking at pay and equity? So questions like that. One of the stark things that came out for me, a highlight, is that not most, but a lot of companies were not even tracking this data. They weren't capturing this. And it's not a novel idea, but for me, that's okay. So we know where we need to start. We need to encourage our member companies to start capturing this data, and why, making the case as to why it's important to capture. Just think about this, right? Think about recruitment for an organization. And let's say your organization is predominantly able-bodied white men at the leadership levels, right? Actually, that's pretty consistent with what you see in Fortune 500 companies.
Yeah.
And you can make all sorts of assertions and assumptions about that. But that's all that it would be unless you're looking at capturing some of the data and doing some analysis on maybe the applicant flow. Are there certain populations that are getting through the pipeline faster than others? Are some kind of trailing off? Let's look at our promotion rates into middle management and director level, VP level, and then are certain groups ascending faster than others? Is there a bottleneck? You can't ask those questions unless you're capturing the data to see if there may potentially be some inherent bias in the systems, right? We'd like to say that, of course, there's racism, there's sexism, but those would just be unsubstantiated assertions without the data. So what really stood out for me was the organizations need to start capturing the data to identify if there's an issue or a gap, then to determine how to address those issues with solutions, right? You have to follow that pragmatic way of thinking in order to fix a problem. For instance, I don't go to the doctor with an ailment and say, just prescribe me this. They have to do an assessment. I mean, if a doctor just wanted to prescribe me something without doing a full evaluation, I'm leaving. So,
right.
And it's no different here. So with the survey, and it's getting better year over year, and that's what we want to see. We want to see more data being collected. And then you think about like NASDAQ proposing the rule that publicly traded companies on their exchange now have to disclose their diversity board statistics. And then in the next 2 years or so, have diverse people on their board. You saw the bill that was issued in California, where the public companies have to have diverse board members as well in the next couple of years. And you see this wave happening of accountability, of saying, we need to have more representation from underrepresented populations, leadership positions. We're asking for transparency. We're asking for you to share your results, to be transparent, and so that we can measure success. Before, I think a lot of companies were comfortable with not sharing for whatever reason. There might have been some shame around where they are, but we're moving toward more transparency, which leads to more accountability. So I was really happy to see the survey, understanding that it's going to get better year over year as we encourage our member companies and larger to continue to capture the data, report the data. Let's look at what it's saying, and then let's move together, right? After we identify the issues, we move together to improve some of these areas. That's just going to better the entire industry at large, not just one or two companies, but the entire industry. I really want the biotech space and life science space to be the envy of all industries, where the best and the brightest and diverse people come here for flourishing careers of innovation and problem solving.
Yeah. So I was thinking a little bit about, kind of catalysts in this space. And as I read through that report, one of the things that struck me was that nearly every single company polled had either, anti-harassment programs or anything like that. And I thought back to, it was a few years ago, but there was a famous, party at JP Morgan where the people that threw the party basically hired a bunch of models to be around the party and the whole bit. And almost the entire industry looked at that and was appalled, right? And that party had existed before, but it took kind of that 1 year. I don't know exactly what it was. People said, you know what, this is wrong, and we're not going to stand up for this anymore. And there was a very big wave of a level of both appreciation and recognition that in a lot of ways women had been disadvantaged in biotech and the sciences broadly for a long time, right? And that, I think, helped in some way for people to say, we have to get better at this, right? And do you feel like there's other ways or other things that could kind of serve as a catalyst for the industry to look at itself and say, yeah, here's how we need to get better, here's another thing that we need to work on? How do we actually get more underrepresented people to be represented among the ranks of the industry?
Yeah, there's one of the questions that I've asked in my career whenever I've looked for a new EDI opportunity, right? Some company has a position open. One of the questions that I asked the interviewer and the company, why do you have this position? The reason why I asked that is because it could be a few things. One, there was some egregious EDI related event that happened and they need to bring in an expert to clean up a mess, like that JP Morgan example that you gave. And so that's much more reactive. Or is it because you organization have recognized that there is a need to be progressive around creating an inclusive environment where we can really tap into the genius of the diverse population? Those are two different motivators for why you have EDI work going on in an organization, right? And so there's a maturity associated with your EDI journey, right? At the most basic level, you have to have anti-harassment, no discrimination laws. You have to have EEO complaint systems in place, and you might check off numbers of people. We have this many women, this many people of color, we have this many people with disabilities, because you got to report that. If you're a company over 100 employees, you got to report that to the EEOC. At the most basic fundamental level, that's why equity, diversity, and inclusion is important. And there's various models in the industry around the EDI maturity, level 1 all the way through 5. There's some that go to 4 or 6. But the idea is most organizations want to start at 1 where they have the foundational. It's just like HR practices. You need benefits, you need compensation, you need pay, you need all those things. It's like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. At the most foundational level, you have these things so people can do their jobs, right? And so that's important from an EDI standpoint. When you get to the far end, the most progressive end of the maturity model, you are really understanding how having a diverse workforce affects the bottom line and gives you a competitive business advantage for the products you develop, the penetration into the market, right? How you relate to your customer base, and so many different ways that having a diverse, inclusive organization benefits your business. That's the top of the maturity, and that's where you want to get to. So organizations really need to understand the value associated with matriculating to each level. throughout that maturity model. And I would tend to argue with companies, don't wait till a George Floyd murder happens, right? Or a Black Lives Matter movement happens, or a Me Too movement to happen in order for you to do something, right? To speak out publicly about it or make a pledge or a commitment or something. It's important to do that in the moment, but don't let it be a moment in time and all reactionary. I think it has to be, EDI has to be woven into the fabric of your organization in just how you operate, right? Managers, studies show that when people leave organizations, most times it's because of their good or bad relationship with their frontline manager, their direct link. And so our managers our frontline managers are critically important. They need to be culturally competent, right? We as an organization need to invest into our managers and leaders who are managing teams of diverse people to know how to connect, kind of like that Patrick McLaurin story that I told you about, right? How to connect with me. That's why I was like, I will follow you wherever you go, man.
Yep.
You just let me know. I'm with you, right? We have our good days, our bad days, but I know you got me and I got you. So, right. And that's important. So back to the original point, there is a maturity associated with it. Organizations need to understand why matriculating to the next level up in that maturity model matters, right? The value associated with it. The only other thing that I'll say is this: when I was working at the office of the comptroller or the currency, knowing your audience when you communicate about these issues is critically important, because you could try to communicate it in one way and it's just not received well by that audience. The reason why I bring up the OCC is because they are financial regulators, which means they manage risk. They speak in terms of managing risk. So when the team would go and talk to the leaders of the organizations and say, investing in equity, diversity, and inclusion is important because it increases this and it's great for this, and here's the value prop, and it didn't resonate with them. It's like, that's great and all, but yeah, we had to go back and realize that, wait a second, these are financial regulators. They've been doing this for years. That's how they speak. That's how they perceive the world. So then when we went back and made presentations to them to get them on board, we started talking in risk mitigation ways. If you don't do this, this is what will happen. And then it was like, oh,
why didn't you say so before? Right?
Exactly. So
as a recovering litigator, I'm totally on board with that strategy.
Right. So knowing your audience is critically important when you're communicating important information. I may think it's the best information in the world, and of course you should get this. Of course you should understand this. But if it's not your language, then we're just missing each other. So I don't know if I answered your question, Derek. I kind of went a few different places, but those are my thoughts on it.
I think you did.
Yeah, let me and let's shift to bio. So and so for our audience, for those of you, we've mentioned it a couple of times, but for those that don't know, NewYorkBIO has pulled together, we're called a cross-functional team, right? Sort of across the entire ecosystem within New York, is we've pulled together an EDI task force and we're working. So if any of those who are listening today and enjoying the conversation want to get engaged in New York and specifically, reach out to me. We're happy. The more hands, the lighter work. But talk to us about what you're implementing at Bio and your equality agenda, because that's been a really, over a very short time, a very impressive list of sort of goals and objectives. And so talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, thank you for that. So when I came on board, one of the things that I wanted to do for Bio was develop an overarching bio equity, diversity, and inclusion strategy. I think I mentioned it earlier that a lot of organizations do EDI work in fits and spurts in certain corners or pockets of the organization, and it's not always comprehensive or enterprise. So one of the things that I wanted to work with leadership on was developing an overarching strategy that had multiple dimensions of it. One was focusing internal to the organization. If we want to really be the employer of choice in the trade association biotech space, that intersection, we have to embody that. We have to make sure that we are providing employees with the best experience throughout their careers here. And that's looking at all of our policies, our programs, and our practices, and then making improvements in areas where everyone can have a chance to participate, but with a particular eye on populations that might not be participating at the same level as others, right? The other dimension of this overarching strategy would be the biotech, how we support the biotech industry. This is working with our member companies and our state affiliates. Everyone, just like you said, Jennifer, is doing great work, from what I understand, around their own equity, diversity, and inclusion initiatives. And I've spent the better part of last fall through the winter talking to the CSBA groups and other state affiliates about what they're doing and trying to provide some insight and seeing where we can connect, right? Because I think being able to connect and making sure we have as a much more robust output or products and just is the way to go. I think we have to leverage our expertise in where it's appropriate. So we are looking at that and how we can do more work in that area. We also have, with regard to the industry, we have a Workforce Development, Diversity, and Inclusion Committee, or WDDI, which is a collection of our board members. And I would say it's about 15 to 17 or so board members who have an interest, right? These are CEO leaders that have an interest in workforce diversity. And we had some goals around increasing representation in leadership positions on boards, functional C-suite positions, and we're working to continue to drive that home, and we're looking to expand some of our outreaches as well around the talent pool and getting more people into the STEM workforce earlier in their careers so that we can build a pipeline all the way through. And then the last sort of dimension, which is the bioequality agenda, and that's what you're referring to. So Dr. Michelle McMurray-Heath, our new CEO, who's fantastic, who came on board in June of last year, challenged bio, okay? She came in and challenged us to make sure that we had a particular and core focus on social justice, right? All that bio does with our member companies, we can be a leader in trying to counteract some of the systemic and structural racism that we've seen in the healthcare system, in the workforce, and also when you think about the growing biotech economy. So the bioequality agenda is a national effort in collaboration with our partners and member companies. It's a long-term effort to really reverse some of those those unfortunate realities that certain populations have been living with. So there's three sort of dimensions or three pillars to it. And the first one is around promoting health equity. So when you think about what was the big issue, we saw the unfortunate statistics around COVID and how it attacked people of color more than other populations. And it was egregious. All it did was just highlight the issues that were there. I think there had been some really good efforts previously, by lawmakers and by healthcare professionals and policymakers to try to improve those situations. But COVID just really shined a spotlight on why we needed to accelerate our work in this area and why it's a matter of life and death for millions of people. So we wanted to focus our efforts there to see how we could increase clinical trial diversity, making sure we have the right people or the people who have been marginalized being researched in clinical trials so that whatever drugs or therapies were developed would actually work for the populations that's being the hardest hit. And so there's a tremendous amount of work that we've been doing in that particular space. The next area around the bioequality agenda is around investing in the current and next generation of scientists. It's important. We know that when you go back early in a person's career, even high school or middle school for that matter, you think of African American kids, we just hadn't been exposed to STEM as much as others, or see it as a viable career opportunity, because there's not a lot of us that are having successful careers in this for us to aspire to be like. And so how can we really focus on improving that problem and reversing that as well, and trying to get more energy and interest at an early age, and then work through the entire pipeline. We're looking at industry professionals who go through great industry sponsored mentoring programs, and but once they finish those fellowship programs, and then they're just kind of lost to follow up. We want to connect all of them with our member companies to say, hey, here's a great career opportunity for you to eventually get into leadership positions. We have to go deeper into the pipeline in hopes of bringing these underrepresented populations along to eventually ascending into the leadership positions that we want to see.
Yeah.
It's not enough just to say we're going to focus at the top rung and that's it.
Yeah.
Right? You got to go deeper into it. And then the last area around bioequality is around really creating and expanding opportunities, particularly for women and other underrepresented populations in the growing biotech economy. So when you think about that, most entrepreneurs last year during COVID were women of color who lost businesses, and just, I mean, historically, they're getting less than 1% of all VC funding. It's just egregious, the statistics on this. We wanted to do our part, because if you don't have wealth, it's hard to have access to a whole lot of other things, right? And I talked about being in Harlem in an impoverished neighborhood. Well, we didn't have the financial means to have the best education or the best healthcare or the best grocery stores, the Wegmans, the Trader Joe's, and to bring great food home to nourish our bodies. And so we're looking at our supply chains, right? We're seeing, are we patronizing businesses that are owned by women and people of color? If not, why not? How do we be more intentional? It's not a decline in quality or a compromise in that. It's actually just being intentional about making sure that we're giving a shot to the people that need it the most, who are bringing a service and a product that's important to what we do. Let's be intentional about making sure we hook up to them and continue to build out those partnerships. We're also looking at NIH, NSF, the grants that they're giving out. And unfortunately, they haven't been doing great in terms of awarding grants to people of color. We want to examine why, and if there's anything we can do in that area to encourage them to be more intentional about that. Maybe there's some potential bias in their selection criteria, who knows? But if we can work with our partners to look into some of those areas and reverse that slowly, and then hopefully gain some more speed, that's what we're going to do. So there's a lot that we have undertaking. We don't want to boil the ocean, right? We have to be specific and strategic about how we prioritize those steps, but we understand this is a long game. This is not going to change overnight, but we're committed to doing this. And I'm excited and proud to be a part of it.
No, it's amazing. And, and what we're doing is sort of earlier stage here is also assessing what programs are existing. For example, we had a call yesterday, our subgroup looking at sort of the education piece, right? The STEM education piece. We had a call with the head of Rockefeller's Rock EDU, which they do a lot of outreach. And so finding out how they found their schools to partner with, and where they're finding students from underrepresented communities, and looking at existing programs and how we can leverage existing programs to give them more support. Right? There are a lot of programs that are already out there, particularly in that space. And like, what ones can we actually then, hopefully provide a catalyst for? Like, NewYorkBIO doesn't have to create our own program, because there's a lot of work that's really good, and we can partner with Bio, and we can partner with others to really sort of leverage that support.
I'm sorry. I was just going to say, Jennifer, I think that's an excellent point. A lot of times there's energy and enthusiasm around doing EDI work. And sometimes that's the idea is that, okay, we got to create something new. You really don't. Yeah. To your point, there are tremendous programs that are out there that have been doing this for years, that have the relationships in the community, that have the credibility already established, that if you hook in with them and help bolster their progress, why not? I mean, I think that's the fastest, most effective way to accelerate change, is to do just that. So I would say that on a macro level, if you want to focus in this area, let's see what's out there. Let's do an environmental scan first and see which organizations are doing it well, and how can we connect up? Because if our goals and theirs align, it just makes sense. right? To bring them together and augment what they're doing. So I think that's a brilliant point, Jennifer. I commend you all for doing that.
You actually inspired it. You probably don't remember this, but Elliott and I had a conversation last fall at some point, and you were talking about needing to gather data, because I think everyone was in this position of, I want to do something, right? I want to do something, and we really want to help. And you were talking to me about how we need to gather data and understand what's existing out there. And I was like, oh, you're right. I don't need to be drafting some curricula for, like middle school scientists. That's the last thing anybody wants from me. And I was like, let's see what's existing, that we have a lot of resources and a lot of great ideas, and how we can leverage that. And then if there are things we need to build, we can do it. But that doesn't necessarily need to be the starting point. What advice would you give for those who are listening today, and like who are in their organizations and want their organization to start doing more, doing better? How do they start those conversations?
Well, first, you want to find out, I think, what's been done in the organization, because sometimes you just need to pick up a thread, right? Because you don't want to reinvent the wheel. If some good things had been done, you also don't want to start something or go down a path that had been done and didn't succeed.
Yeah.
Because then you're just being redundant. You want to be as effective and as efficient as possible. So I would go around to the organization, just asking questions, doing your homework first on what the organization thinks about doing this work. Has there been any efforts done before? How well were they received? Were they effective or not? Do that. Once you kind of gather that data, then you can determine what makes sense on where you want to go, right? What do you want to accomplish? And I would say if it's a relatively new program, I'd start small first, right? I'd start small and say, okay, in the next 12 to 18 months, here's what I'd like for us to do. This is the goal, whatever it is. Maybe it's increasing the diversity applicant pool, right, that comes into the organization. Or if it's looking at potential promotions or whatever it is, just start 12 to 18 months out and say, this is where I think we should go. And then you work backwards from there to say, here are the activities that I think we need to do to get to that place. It's also going to take these resources, because I don't think any leader is going to listen to you unless you can articulate how you intend for the organization to get there. They want to hear the value proposition, but again, know the audience, know the audience, right? Speak their language, and then be able to share your proposal on how you think you need to get there and what needs to be considered in doing that. What's also critically important is whatever you are proposing has to be connected to the business outcomes. If it's not, it will be seen as a separate program or initiative that will die on the vine. Right. I can't say it any other way, but it'll ultimately die on the vine, because when you're in a moment of stress, business stress, what then happens is you focus on the business imperatives. And if your program or initiative is running concurrent to it, but not connected, it will sink lower on the priority list during those times of stress. But if it's integrated and becomes a part of just what the organization does, and you can communicate how it does or articulate that, then you have a much greater success probability.
Yeah. So we only have a couple minutes left, and I wanted the last piece here to be as follows. I think we're going to come around the corner on COVID eventually, and we're going to return to work. We're going to be back in the office. We're going to be doing things in person. What are some of the things you would say to leaders in the industry about kind of the opportunity that they have when people start coming back to the office again? How should they best take advantage of the time when people come back in person to really kind of further some of the points that we've been talking about?
Leaders have got to challenge their ways of thinking. And if they're incapable of challenging the way that they think, they have to go to a peer and ask them to be their accountability partner. Challenge me on something that I'm thinking. What I mean by that is, before the pandemic, there were leaders in organizations that felt you can never work from home. You need to be in person, right? To be productive, I need to see you, you need to see me, you need to be here. And guess what? That has been dismantled, right? Because we've all had to work. And guess what? We've been flourishing in a lot of ways. And so you have to challenge. You don't want to wait till the next pandemic to challenge your way of thinking, leaders. You need to challenge it now. If last year was any lesson to learn, it's that. It's okay, this is the way that I believe it needs to happen, but let me have someone challenge me on an alternative way of looking at it and be more inclusive and intentional about seeking out those perspectives on it. I think leaders also have to be willing to extend a bit more grace as people come back into the office. There will be some hesitancy from some folks coming in just because it's going to take some time. We've been apart for a very long time and got comfortable in our homes. You know, some have, not everyone. I've gotten pretty comfortable, but you have to make sure you're being flexible enough for the entire workforce to provide a productive work environment and arrangement where everyone can flourish and the organization continues to be effective in what it needs to do. So leaders just have to challenge the way they think. They have to be more flexible. I think extend a little bit more grace. And I will say, leaders, be transparent about who you are. Show your vulnerabilities. It's okay. We all have them. You don't always have to be sanitized, right? Nobody really wants to see that all the time. They want to know that you're a human being just like them. And then engage. Have the courage to engage in difficult conversations so you can learn with the goal of learning and hopefully changing over time.
Great. This has been a fantastic discussion, Elliott. Thank you so much for joining us today. It was really our pleasure to host you.
Yep.
It's been my pleasure, and I love New York. So thank you for having me, Jennifer and Derek. I had a lot of fun.
Great.
All right, you're gonna come hang out with us in person when we can do that again. All right,
for sure.
To New York, we'll have fun.
For sure.
Thank you so much.
Thanks
everybody.
so much.
Have a great day.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for tuning in to NewYorkBIO's virtual breakfast series. Join us every Tuesday at 9 a.m. for more discussions with leaders from across the healthcare spectrum. For more information on NewYorkBIO, please visit us at www.newyorkbio.org.